The day I became successful, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. After years of silence, suddenly everyone wanted to talk to me. My mother called, my brothers called, my cousins called, even relatives I hadn't heard from in over a decade were leaving messages. But where were they when I was sleeping in my car? Where were they when I couldn't afford food? Where were they when I begged for help and they turned their backs on me? The truth is, my family didn't believe in me when I had nothing. They laughed at my dreams. They called me a failure. Some even said I would never amount to anything. Then everything changed. One business deal transformed my life overnight. The same people who abandoned me suddenly wanted to be part of it. But they didn't know something. I had kept every message, every insult, every rejection. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Ethan Carter, and for most of my life, I believed family was supposed to be the one thing you could always count on. Friends came and went, relationships ended, jobs disappeared, but family was supposed to stay. At least that was what my father used to tell me when I was a kid growing up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. Back then, life felt simple. We weren't rich, but we weren't struggling either. My father worked as a mechanic. My mother worked part-time at a grocery store. My two older brothers, Ryan and Tyler, were the stars of the family. Ryan was a football player. Tyler was a straight-A student. Everywhere they went, people praised them. Teachers talked about them. Neighbors admired them. Meanwhile, I was the quiet kid who spent most of his time reading books and sketching business ideas in old notebooks. I wasn't interested in sports. I wasn't interested in fitting in. I dreamed about building something of my own one day, though I had no idea what that would look like. The older I got, the more obvious it became that I was different from everyone else in my family. At dinner, conversations revolved around Ryan's football games or Tyler's academic achievements. When I tried talking about my ideas, people smiled politely before changing the subject. At first, I didn't think much about it. Families have favorites sometimes. I assumed things would change as I got older. Instead, the gap only grew wider. By the time I graduated high school, Ryan had a college scholarship, and Tyler had been accepted into a respected university. Everyone celebrated their accomplishments. Relatives traveled from other states to congratulate them. When it came time for my graduation party, hardly anyone showed up. I remember standing in the backyard watching empty chairs while my mother tried to convince me that people were simply busy. Deep down, I knew the truth. Nobody expected much from me. To them, I was the brother who lacked direction, the kid with unrealistic dreams. Still, I refused to give up. After graduation, I enrolled in a local community college while working evening shifts at a warehouse. Every spare moment was spent learning about business, marketing, and technology. I watched interviews with entrepreneurs. I read books borrowed from the library. I studied successful companies and tried understanding how ordinary people built extraordinary lives. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that my future wouldn't be determined by anyone else's expectations. But my family saw things differently. Whenever I talked about starting a business, they laughed. My father would shake his head and tell me to find a stable job. My brothers joked that I would still be living with my parents when I turned 40. Family gatherings became exhausting because every conversation eventually turned into criticism. They acted as though my ambitions were childish fantasies rather than serious goals. Then came the year, everything began falling apart. My father suffered a serious back injury that forced him to stop working. Medical bills started piling up. Tension filled the house. Money became a constant source of stress. Arguments erupted almost every day. My brothers had already moved away and built their own lives, which left me at home helping however I could. I worked longer hours. I contributed most of my paycheck to household expenses. I skipped meals sometimes to make sure my parents could pay their bills. Yet despite everything I sacrificed, I never felt appreciated. It was as if my contributions didn't count because I wasn't successful enough. One evening, after working a 12-hour shift, I came home to hear my mother telling a relative on the phone that she worried I would never amount to anything. She didn't know I was standing in the hallway listening. Those words hit harder than anything anyone had ever said to me. I went to my room and sat in silence for hours. Something changed inside me that night. For the first time, I realized that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. A few months later, I made a decision that shocked everyone. I dropped out of college and used my savings to launch a small online business. It wasn't glamorous. I worked from a second-hand laptop sitting at a folding table in my bedroom. Most days, I earned nothing. Some days, I lost money. But for the first time, I felt like I was building something that belonged to me. My family saw it differently. They called it reckless. They called it irresponsible. They called it proof that I lacked common sense. The criticism became constant. Every failure was treated as evidence that they had been right all along. What they didn't know was that I had never been more determined. Every insult became fuel. Every rejection strengthened my resolve. I promised myself that one day, I would prove them wrong. I just had no idea how much that promise would cost me before the journey was over. The first year of my business was one of the hardest periods of my life. People often look at successful entrepreneurs and imagine a dramatic breakthrough, some magical moment when everything suddenly falls into place. My reality was completely different. Most mornings began with uncertainty and ended with disappointment. I spent countless hours trying to attract customers, studying competitors, redesigning websites, and testing ideas that failed almost immediately. The little savings I had disappeared faster than I expected. Bills piled up on my desk. Debt started creeping into my life. Every month felt like a battle I was losing. Yet somehow, I kept going. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe I simply couldn't bear the thought of proving my family right. Every time I thought about quitting, I remembered the way they looked at me whenever I talked about my dreams. That memory alone was enough to keep me working through another sleepless night. As my financial situation worsened, my family's attitude toward me became colder. They stopped asking about the business altogether. At family gatherings, I felt invisible. Conversations would stop when I entered the room. Relatives exchanged glances whenever my future came up. Sometimes they weren't even subtle about it. One Thanksgiving dinner remains burned into my memory. My uncle David asked how the business was doing. Before I could answer, my older brother Ryan laughed and said, "You mean his expensive hobby?" The table erupted with nervous chuckles. I forced a smile, but inside I felt humiliated. Nobody defended me. Not my parents. Not my cousins. Not even my grandmother, who had always been kind to me. For the rest of the evening, I sat quietly, listening as everyone discussed careers, promotions, and achievements. I felt like an outsider in my own family. By the time I drove home that night, I realized something painful. They weren't waiting for me to succeed. They were waiting for me to fail. A few months later, my situation reached a breaking point. The business was barely generating enough income to survive. My landlord raised the rent. My car needed repairs I couldn't afford. Collection notices started arriving in the mail. One afternoon, after checking my bank account and seeing less than $50 remaining, I finally swallowed my pride and reached out for help. I called Ryan first. He was earning a comfortable salary and owned a nice home. I didn't ask for much. I simply explained my situation and requested a small loan to help me stay afloat. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then he sighed and told me I needed to face reality. He said giving me money would only encourage irresponsible decisions. Before ending the call, he told me to get a real job. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but the disappointment stayed with me for weeks. I wish I could say Ryan's reaction surprised me, but it didn't. What hurt more was what happened afterward. I called Tyler next, then my mother, then 2 cousins who had always claimed we were close. Every conversation ended the same way. Some offered excuses. Others offered criticism. Nobody offered help. For years, I had contributed money when family members faced emergencies. I had babysat children, helped relatives move, worked unpaid hours repairing homes and solving problems. Yet when I finally needed support, everyone suddenly had reasons they couldn't be there. The message was clear. My struggles were my own responsibility. Their support came with conditions. As long as I fit their definition of success, I mattered. The moment I fell outside that definition, I became expendable. The lowest point came during the winter of my 26th year. I lost my apartment. Technically, I left before the eviction process was completed, but the result was the same. I packed everything I owned into my aging sedan and drove away with nowhere to go. For the next several weeks, my car became my home. During the day, I worked from coffee shops and public libraries. At night, I parked in different locations, so nobody would notice I was sleeping there. I learned which parking lots were quiet and which security guards were understanding. I learned how to stretch a few dollars into several meals. I learned how lonely life could become when nobody checked on you. What made it even harder was knowing that my family lived less than an hour away. They had spare bedrooms, comfortable homes, warm beds, yet not one person called to ask if I was okay. One evening, while sitting in a grocery store parking lot, I received a group text message from family members discussing plans for Christmas. They were coordinating travel arrangements, gift exchanges, and dinner reservations. Dozens of messages appeared on my screen. Nobody mentioned me. Nobody asked if I would be attending. It was as if I no longer existed. I stared at the phone for several minutes before setting it down. That moment hurt more than sleeping in my car. It wasn't the lack of an invitation. It was the realization that my absence didn't matter. The people I had spent my entire life trying to impress had already written me off. In their minds, I was the family disappointment, the cautionary tale, the example they used when explaining why people should play it safe. What none of them knew was that something unexpected was about to happen. Around the same time my life appeared to be collapsing, I stumbled across an opportunity that would eventually change everything. At first, it seemed insignificant. Just another business experiment. Another idea among hundreds of failed attempts. I almost ignored it completely. Looking back now, that decision would become the turning point of my entire life. At the time, I had no reason to believe my life was about to change. Every morning still began inside my car. Every night still ended with uncertainty. The opportunity that would eventually transform my future looked ordinary when it first appeared. In fact, I nearly ignored it. I had spent years chasing ideas that led nowhere, and this one seemed no different. Yet something about it kept pulling my attention back. During long hours at the library, I researched the market, studied customer behavior, and analyzed trends. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that there was a real gap people were willing to pay to solve. For the first time in years, I wasn't guessing. I wasn't hoping. I was seeing actual evidence. The problem was that I had no money left. Even if the idea worked, I lacked the resources to build it properly. Once again, I found myself facing the same obstacle that had followed me for years. Opportunity was standing in front of me, but I couldn't afford to reach it. Despite the challenges, I started working on the project anyway. Every day followed the same routine. I woke up before sunrise, cleaned up at a public gym using the cheapest membership available, spent hours working from coffee shops, and used every spare minute developing the business. It was exhausting. There were days when I questioned my sanity. Most people my age were building careers, buying homes, and starting families. Meanwhile, I was sleeping in a car while chasing a dream nobody believed in. Yet something inside me refused to quit. Maybe I had already lost so much that failure no longer scared me. Maybe I simply had nothing left to lose. Whatever the reason, I kept moving forward. Week after week, month after month, I continued building while the rest of the world assumed I was wasting my life. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting in the corner of a crowded coffee shop. An unfamiliar number appeared on my screen. Normally, I ignored calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Debt collectors had become a regular part of my life. But something told me to answer. The voice on the other end belonged to a business owner from Texas who had somehow discovered one of my online projects. He wasn't interested in buying anything. He wanted to partner with me. At first, I assumed it was a scam. Opportunities like that didn't happen to people in my situation. But as the conversation continued, it became clear he was serious. He had seen potential in my work. More importantly, he was willing to invest money to help expand it. When the call ended, I sat frozen for several minutes. For the first time in years, someone outside my family believed in me. The partnership didn't make me rich overnight. Success rarely happens that way. What it did provide was something far more valuable. It gave me a chance. For months, I worked harder than ever. The business grew slowly but steadily. New customers arrived. Revenue increased. Small wins started stacking together. By the end of the year, I was earning enough to rent a modest apartment. It wasn't luxurious, but after sleeping in my car, it felt like a mansion. I remember sitting on the floor the first night because I couldn't afford furniture yet. Looking around the empty room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not hope based on dreams or promises. Hope based on results. For the first time, the future looked different. Ironically, that was when my family started paying attention again. It began with subtle changes. My mother suddenly called more often. Ryan asked questions about my work. Relatives who had ignored me for years started liking my social media posts. At first I thought maybe they were finally recognizing my effort. Maybe they were proud of me. But something felt strange. The timing didn't make sense. During the years I struggled, nobody seemed interested. Now that things were improving, everyone suddenly wanted updates. I tried not to think about it too much. Deep down, I wanted to believe their intentions were genuine. I wanted to believe family was still family. Unfortunately, reality would soon prove otherwise. One evening, I attended a family barbecue at my parents' house. It was the first gathering I had attended in months. As I walked through the backyard, I noticed something unusual. People who rarely spoke to me were approaching with smiles. Cousins asked about my business. Uncles wanted investment advice. Even Ryan seemed unusually friendly. At first, the attention felt nice. After years of being treated like an embarrassment, it was refreshing to be included in conversations. But the longer the evening continued, the more uncomfortable I became. Nobody asked how I survived during the difficult years. Nobody apologized for disappearing when I needed help. They wanted to discuss money. They wanted to discuss growth. They wanted to discuss success. It was as though the years of struggle had been erased from history. Then something happened that completely changed the way I viewed my family. As the evening was winding down, I walked into the kitchen to grab a drink. That's when I overheard a conversation between two relatives. They didn't realize I was standing nearby. One of them laughed and said, "Looks like Ethan finally got lucky." The other responded, "Yeah, but let's see how long it lasts." They continued talking about me as though I wasn't there. Their words weren't supportive. They weren't proud. They were skeptical, almost disappointed. For years, I had believed my family wanted me to succeed. I assumed their criticism came from concern. Hearing that conversation forced me to confront a painful possibility. Maybe some of them actually preferred seeing me struggle. That realization stayed with me long after the barbecue ended. Over the following weeks, I started noticing things I had previously ignored. Certain relatives only called when they needed something. Conversations always seemed to circle back to money. People who once mocked my ambitions were suddenly acting like they had supported me from the beginning. The more attention I paid, the more uncomfortable I became. It felt as though I was seeing my family clearly for the first time. And the picture wasn't flattering. Then one night, while sorting through old emails, I discovered something that would explain everything. A message. One message buried among thousands of others. A message I had never seen before. And when I finally read it, I realized my family had been hiding a secret from me for years. A secret that would expose the real reason they abandoned me when I needed them most. At first, the email didn't seem important. I almost deleted it. The message was old, buried beneath years of newsletters, receipts, and forgotten conversations. The sender was my grandmother, Margaret Carter. Seeing her name immediately caught my attention because my grandmother rarely used email. In fact, she usually preferred handwritten letters or phone calls. Curious, I opened the message. The email had been sent nearly 4 years earlier. The problem was that I had never received it. Somehow, it had been redirected into an old spam folder that I hadn't checked in years. The subject line simply read, "Please call me." I started reading. As the words appeared on the screen, my heart began beating faster. My grandmother explained that she wanted to discuss something important about the family. She wrote that certain decisions being made by my parents concerned her. She believed I deserved to know the truth. She mentioned conversations she had overheard involving my mother and my older brothers. Then the message ended abruptly. There was no explanation, no details, no truth. Just a request for me to call her. I checked the date again. The email had been sent only a few weeks before my grandmother suffered the stroke that eventually affected her memory. By the time she recovered, she rarely talked about family matters anymore. For years, whatever she wanted to tell me had remained hidden. Now the discovery raised more questions than answers. The next day, I drove to visit her. My grandmother was 82 years old by then. She still lived in the same house, where countless family holidays had taken place throughout my childhood. Walking through the front door felt like stepping into the past. The familiar smell of old books and fresh coffee filled the air. Family photographs lined the walls. Most of them featured Ryan and Tyler. Only a few included me. Even that detail felt different now. My grandmother welcomed me warmly. We talked about ordinary things for nearly an hour before I finally mentioned the email. The moment I brought it up, something changed in her expression. She looked nervous. For a long time, she remained silent. Then she slowly looked toward the living room window. "I wondered if you would ever find that message." My stomach tightened. "What were you trying to tell me?" She hesitated. "I don't know if I should." The answer immediately alarmed me. "Grandma," she looked at me sadly. "Ethan, some truths hurt." I leaned forward. "I need to know." Another long silence followed. Finally, she nodded. "What happened to you wasn't an accident." The room suddenly felt smaller. "What do you mean?" My grandmother folded her hands together. "For years, your family treated you differently." I laughed bitterly. "That's not exactly a secret." "No," she shook her head. "It goes deeper than that." My heartbeat accelerated. I could feel it pounding inside my chest. "What are you talking about?" She took a deep breath. Then she said something I never expected. Your father wasn't the one making those decisions. I stared at her. What? Most people think your father favored your brothers. She paused. But your mother was the one pushing it. The words hit me like a punch. My mother. That didn't make sense. My father had always been strict. He had always seemed disappointed in me. My mother, despite her criticism, appeared softer, kinder. At least that's what I believed. My grandmother continued speaking. When you were young, your father actually defended you. I felt completely confused. What? He believed in your ideas. The room fell silent. For years, I had blamed my father. Now everything seemed upside down. My grandmother slowly stood and walked toward an old cabinet. After searching through several folders, she returned holding a small stack of papers. My pulse quickened. What is that? She handed them to me. The documents were old. Some were letters. Others were handwritten notes. As I began reading, my confusion grew. Several of the notes came from conversations between family members years earlier. My grandmother had apparently written down important events she didn't want to forget. One note stood out immediately. The date showed I was 16 years old. According to the note, my father had wanted to help me attend a summer business program for young entrepreneurs. The opportunity could have introduced me to mentors and scholarships. I had never heard about it, not once. I looked up. What is this? My grandmother sighed. Your father wanted you to go. My chest tightened. Why didn't I? The answer came quietly. Because your mother said it would be a waste of money. I felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath me. Another note described a similar situation. Then another. And another. Each one told the same story. Opportunities, programs, connections, support, things that had somehow disappeared before reaching me. For years, I believed I simply wasn't talented enough. Now I was discovering that some opportunities never reached me at all. Someone had been standing in the way. Someone inside my own home. The more I read, the worse it became. My grandmother eventually looked away. Tears formed in her eyes. I tried speaking up. I remained silent. But every time I did, your mother became angry. The room felt unbearably quiet. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to think. Everything I believed about my childhood was being rewritten. Then my grandmother revealed something even more disturbing. Something she had never told anyone else. Several years before I started my business, she had overheard a conversation between my mother and one of my aunts. A conversation she never forgot. What conversation? My voice barely sounded like my own. My grandmother looked directly into my eyes. Then she repeated the words she had heard. Words that would haunt me for weeks afterward. She said Ethan spends too much time dreaming. I frowned. That didn't seem shocking. But then my grandmother continued. And she said she was tired of hearing about your ideas because she didn't want you getting your hopes up. I remained confused. Until my grandmother added the final sentence. The sentence that changed everything. She said it was easier if you failed early. My entire body went cold. Failed early. Not protected. Not guided. Failed. The words echoed inside my head. For years I thought my family abandoned me because they didn't believe in me. Now I was beginning to suspect something far worse. Someone may have been making sure I never had the chance to succeed in the first place. And as shocking as that realization was, an even bigger secret was waiting to be uncovered. Because hidden among my grandmother's papers was a letter. A letter written by my father years earlier. A letter I had never seen before. A letter containing information that would completely change my understanding of my family forever. I stared at the letter for several seconds before opening it. My hands were shaking. Part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know what was inside. Over the past few hours, everything I thought I knew about my childhood had already been turned upside down. The father I blamed for years was suddenly looking very different. The mother I believed had supported me seemed connected to decisions that had quietly shaped my entire life. Every answer uncovered two new questions. And now there was this letter. A letter my father had written years ago. A letter I was never supposed to see. My grandmother sat quietly across from me as I unfolded the yellowed pages. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to my father. The date at the top immediately caught my attention. The letter had been written nearly 8 years earlier. At first, I assumed it was addressed to my grandmother. Then I noticed something else. It was addressed to me. My chest tightened. He had written it for me. The first few lines were simple. He explained that if I was reading the letter, it meant certain things had finally come to light. He apologized for staying silent for so many years. He admitted there were conversations he should have had with me long ago. The further I read, the heavier the letter became. My father described years of arguments inside our home. Arguments I never knew existed. Arguments about me. Arguments about my future. Arguments about opportunities my mother believed were unrealistic. According to the letter, every time I became excited about a new idea, my father encouraged me privately. But whenever he tried supporting those ideas publicly, conflict followed. At first, I struggled to understand. Why would my mother care so much? Why would she repeatedly stand in the way? Then I reached a paragraph that made my stomach drop. My father wrote that my mother had always feared disappointment. She grew up in poverty. She spent her childhood watching relatives chase dreams that never worked out. Businesses failed. Investments collapsed. Families lost homes. According to my father, those experiences left deep scars. She became convinced that dreams were dangerous. Hope was dangerous. Risk was dangerous. The safest path was always the best path. As I continued reading, I realized something painful. My mother wasn't trying to hurt me, at least not intentionally. She genuinely believed she was protecting me. The problem was that her version of protection looked a lot like limitation. Every opportunity she blocked. Every risk she discouraged. Every dream she dismissed. She believed she was preventing future heartbreak. Instead, she was creating it. The realization left me emotionally exhausted. Part of me felt relieved. Part of me felt angry. And part of me didn't know what to feel anymore. Then I reached the final pages. And that's when everything changed. Because the letter wasn't finished. There was another reason my father had written it. A much bigger reason. One he had hidden for years. My eyes scanned the next paragraph. The moment I read it, I froze. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. The sentence was short, simple, but devastating. There is something about our family you deserve to know. I felt my pulse racing. The next few lines explained that years earlier, before I was born, my parents had experienced a tragedy they rarely discussed, a tragedy that shaped the entire family. According to my father, my mother had given birth to another son before me, a child who died shortly after birth. I lowered the letter. The room seemed completely silent. I had never heard this story, not once, not from my parents, not from my brothers, not from any relatives, nothing. My grandmother quietly nodded. She could tell I had reached that section. It's true, she said softly. I looked at her. Why didn't anyone tell me? Tears appeared in her eyes. Your mother couldn't talk about it. I looked back down at the page. Suddenly, pieces of the puzzle started moving. Not fitting together completely, but moving. The letter explained that after losing her first child, my mother became consumed by fear. Fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of disappointment, fear of watching another child suffer. As the years passed, that fear influenced everything, including how she raised me, especially how she raised me. According to my father, she viewed Ryan and Tyler differently because they followed traditional paths, school, careers, predictable futures. But I was different. I wanted uncertainty, entrepreneurship, risk, possibility. Every dream I pursued reminded her of situations she couldn't control, and that terrified her. The explanation answered some questions, but not all of them, because fear alone didn't explain everything. Fear didn't explain why my family abandoned me when I needed help. Fear didn't explain why my appeal while I slept in my car. Fear didn't explain why my appeal while I slept in my car. Fear didn't explain why my appeal while I slept in my car. Something else was missing, and deep down, I knew it. My grandmother seemed to sense my thoughts. There are things in that letter your father never knew. I looked up. What do you mean? She hesitated. Then she stood and walked toward another cabinet. This time, she removed a small wooden box, a box that looked older than anything else in the room. Carefully, she placed it on the table between us. What is that? Her expression changed. For the first time all afternoon, she looked genuinely nervous. Inside the box were old photographs, letters, receipts, documents, pieces of family history. Most importantly, there was a notebook belonging to my mother. My pulse quickened. You read her journal? My grandmother slowly nodded. Years ago, the answer shocked me. What was in it? She remained silent. For several seconds, she simply stared at the box. Then she said something that immediately sent a chill down my spine. There were pages about you. I felt my stomach tighten. What kind of pages? Her answer came quietly. The kind that explained why your family treated you differently. The room felt colder. Every instinct told me I was about to uncover something important, something painful, something that would finally explain why I spent years fighting for acceptance that never came. As my grandmother slowly opened the box and reached for the notebook, I realized the truth was much bigger than I imagined. Because the story wasn't just about dreams. It wasn't just about failure. And it wasn't just about fear. It was about a family secret that had influenced every major decision of my life. A secret hidden for decades, and written across the pages of my mother's journal. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The notebook sat on the table between us. It didn't look important. Just an ordinary journal with a worn brown cover and faded pages. Yet somehow it felt heavier than anything I had ever held. Because whatever was written inside had remained hidden for years. And judging by my grandmother's expression, she already knew what I was about to discover. Slowly, she pushed the notebook toward me. I think it's time. My throat felt dry. I opened the first page. Most of the early entries seemed normal. My mother wrote about daily life, grocery shopping, family dinners, school events, and ordinary concerns. For a few minutes, I wondered if we had made a mistake. Maybe the journal contained nothing significant at all. Then I reached an entry written shortly after my 10th birthday. Everything changed. My mother described Ryan winning an academic award. She described Tyler receiving recognition in a local sports competition. Then she mentioned me. Just a few sentences. But those few sentences stopped me cold. Ethan spent another afternoon talking about inventions and business ideas. I worry he lives in a fantasy world. I don't know how to make him understand that life doesn't work that way. I frowned. The entry wasn't cruel. It wasn't hateful. But it revealed something important. Even at 10 years old, my dreams worried her. I kept reading. Months passed between entries. Then years. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every time I appeared in the journal, the same concerns surfaced. Risk, dreams, uncertainty, failure. Again and again, my mother described being afraid of where my ambitions might lead. Meanwhile, entries about Ryan and Tyler looked completely different. She sounded proud, confident, relaxed. The contrast was impossible to miss. As I continued reading, another realization slowly emerged. My mother wasn't angry with me. She was terrified for me. But fear can sometimes cause people to make terrible decisions, and some of those decisions had shaped my entire life. About halfway through the notebook, I found an entry dated shortly after my high school graduation. I remembered that summer clearly. It was the year I started talking seriously about entrepreneurship. The year I wanted to attend business seminars. The year I applied for several programs I never heard back from. According to the journal, my mother had secretly contacted at least one organizer and withdrawn my application. I read the sentence 3 times, then 4. I couldn't believe it. The words remained the same. She had done it herself, without telling me, without asking me, without giving me a chance. I looked up at my grandmother. She nodded slowly. I was afraid you'd find that page. My chest tightened. For years, I blamed myself. I assumed I wasn't qualified. I assumed I wasn't talented enough. Meanwhile, opportunities had been disappearing before they ever reached me. The realization was devastating. But it wasn't the worst part. Not even close. Because as I continued reading, I found entries written during the years when my business struggled. Years I remembered all too well. Years filled with rejection, uncertainty, and loneliness. One particular entry immediately caught my attention. The date matched the same week I called family members asking for help. The week I was desperately trying to avoid losing my apartment. The week everything fell apart. My eyes scanned the page. Then I froze. According to the journal, several relatives had discussed helping me. My uncle David wanted to contribute. One cousin offered temporary housing. Another relative suggested creating a small family fund. I stared at the words in disbelief. Because none of those offers ever reached me. Not one. Instead, every conversation ended with rejection. The notebook explained why. My mother convinced everyone not to help. The room suddenly felt silent, painfully silent. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I simply stared at the page. The explanation was written clearly in her own handwriting. She believed rescuing me would prevent me from learning responsibility. She believed hardship would force me to abandon unrealistic goals. She believed failure would save me from future disappointment. I closed my eyes. For years, I carried resentment toward relatives who turned me away. Now I was discovering many of them had actually wanted to help. The situation was far more complicated than I imagined. My grandmother looked heartbroken. I argued with her. I remained silent. I told her she was making a mistake. Tears appeared in her eyes. But she wouldn't listen. I wasn't angry anymore. At least not in that moment. I was exhausted. Emotionally exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes when your understanding of reality starts collapsing. Nothing felt familiar anymore. Not my childhood, not my family, not even my memories. Then I reached the final section of the journal. And that's where everything became even more confusing. Because the later entries sounded different. Very different. The fear was still there, but now something else appeared alongside it. Regret. The deeper I read, the more obvious it became. My mother was beginning to realize the consequences of her actions. One entry described watching me work late into the night. Another described overhearing relatives mock my business ideas. According to her own words, she wanted to defend me, but didn't know how. Several pages later, she admitted something that surprised me. She wrote that she admired my determination. She admired the fact that I kept moving forward despite constant criticism. She admired my resilience. For the first time, I saw evidence that her feelings were changing. Unfortunately, those realizations came years too late. By then, the damage had already been done. Relationships were broken. Trust was gone. Distance had grown between us. Then I reached the final entry. The last thing she wrote before putting the journal away. As I read it, my entire body became still. The entry wasn't about me. It wasn't about Ryan. It wasn't about Tyler. It was about a conversation. A conversation she had overheard between two family members. A conversation she never expected anyone else to discover. The names mentioned in that entry immediately caught my attention. Because they belonged to people I trusted. People I never suspected. According to the journal, someone else inside the family had been influencing events behind the scenes. Someone who encouraged the criticism. Someone who fueled the divisions. Someone who benefited from keeping me isolated. And based on what I was reading, that person wasn't my mother. It was someone else entirely. Someone much closer than I ever imagined. Someone whose role in my struggles had remained hidden for years. And when I finally uncovered their identity, I realized my family's betrayal was far bigger than a mother's fear. Much bigger. Because the person connected to those conversations had been smiling in my face for years, while quietly helping destroy my future. For several seconds, I simply stared at the final journal entry. I read it once, then again, and then a third time. Each time, I hoped I had misunderstood what was written. But the words never changed. The names remained the same. One of them belonged to my mother. The other belonged to my older brother, Ryan. My heart sank. Of all the possibilities I had considered, Ryan wasn't one of them. He had mocked my business ideas. He had dismissed my dreams. He had refused to help when I was struggling. But I always assumed he was simply being insensitive. I never imagined he might have played a larger role. According to the journal, several years earlier, my mother had overheard Ryan speaking privately with relatives during a family gathering. The conversation centered around me and my future. At first, she thought nothing of it. Then she heard something that bothered her. Ryan was actively encouraging people not to support my business. Not because he believed it would fail, because he believed helping me would be a waste of resources. The distinction mattered. One came from doubt, the other came from intent. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. The journal described multiple occasions where Ryan questioned whether family members should invest time or money into my projects. Each time, he presented himself as practical, responsible, realistic. But according to my mother's own words, there was something else underneath those conversations. Something she couldn't fully explain. At the time, she ignored it. Years later, she regretted doing so. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair. None of this made sense. Ryan had always been successful. He had the career, the house, the recognition. Why would he care about what I was doing? Why would he feel threatened by someone who spent years struggling? My grandmother answered before I even asked. Because success changes family dynamics. I looked at her. What does that mean? She sighed. It means people become comfortable with their place in the family. The room grew quiet. She continued. For most of your life, Ryan was the golden child. The words sounded harsh, but they weren't wrong. Everyone praised him. Everyone admired him. Every family story seemed to revolve around his accomplishments. My grandmother looked directly at me. Then you started chasing something different. I frowned. I was failing. At first, she nodded. But you weren't giving up. The answer confused me. Until she continued. Your determination scared people. I almost laughed. Me? Scary? The idea sounded ridiculous. But my grandmother shook her head. You kept going when everyone expected you to quit. The more she spoke, the more uncomfortable I became. Because deep down, I knew she might be right. Most people expected failure to change me. They expected rejection to make me abandon my dreams. Instead, every setback seemed to make me work harder. And maybe that persistence challenged assumptions people had made about me, assumptions they preferred to keep intact. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the journal. Questions filled my mind, questions that demanded answers. Eventually, I decided to do something I should have done years earlier. I started looking through old messages, emails, text conversations, social media posts, anything connected to that period of my life. At first, I found nothing unusual. Then, small details started appearing. Comments, jokes, conversations, patterns. Ryan seemed present in almost every situation where support disappeared. Not directly, never openly, always subtly. A suggestion here, a warning there, a casual remark planted at exactly the right moment. Individually, none of it seemed important. Together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Then I found something that stopped me cold. An old text conversation between Ryan and one of our cousins. The conversation took place around the same time I lost my apartment. Most of the messages were harmless. Then one sentence jumped off the screen. Eventually he'll realize this business thing isn't going anywhere. I stared at the words. The message wasn't shocking by itself. What came next was, our cousin replied by asking whether someone should check on me. Ryan's response arrived a few minutes later. No. Sometimes people need to hit rock bottom before they learn. Rock bottom. I whispered the words aloud. At the time he sent that message, I was sleeping inside my car, hungry, alone, terrified about the future. And my own brother believed I needed to suffer more. I sat there for a long time, not angry, not yet, mostly disappointed. Because no matter how many times I revisited the evidence, the same question remained. Why? Why would someone who already had everything care so much about my failures? The answer finally arrived from an unexpected source. 2 weeks later, my cousin Jake called me. We hadn't spoken much in years. After exchanging small talk, he asked if we could meet. His tone sounded serious, almost nervous. The next afternoon, we sat across from each other at a quiet diner. For several minutes, neither of us mentioned the family. Then Jake finally leaned forward. I heard you've been asking questions. My stomach tightened. Questions. The journal. Ryan. The past. Apparently word was spreading. I nodded. Jake looked around before lowering his voice. There's something you should know. The seriousness in his expression immediately got my attention. What? He hesitated. Then he said something that completely changed the direction of the story. Your success wasn't the first thing Ryan worried about. I frowned. What do you mean? Jake rubbed his hands together nervously. Years ago, before any of this happened, there was another conversation. The diner suddenly felt much quieter. What conversation? Jake looked directly at me. Then he revealed a secret he had kept for nearly a decade. A secret involving my father. A secret involving an inheritance. And a secret that explained why certain family members became nervous the moment my business started growing. Because according to Jake, the conflict was never really about my dreams. It wasn't about entrepreneurship. And it wasn't about responsibility. The real issue began years earlier, long before I ever started my company. Long before I slept in my car. Long before my family abandoned me. And once I learned what my father had been planning before his injury, I finally understood why some relatives wanted me to remain unsuccessful forever. I sat frozen in my seat. The noise of the diner seemed to disappear. All I could hear was Jake's voice. An inheritance? The word didn't make sense. My family wasn't wealthy. We weren't the kind of people who fought over fortunes or estates. At least that's what I always believed. Jake looked at me carefully. He could tell I was confused. I know what you're thinking. Then explain it. He nodded slowly. The inheritance wasn't huge. That only made me more confused. Then why does it matter? Jake sighed. Because it wasn't about the money. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he finally started explaining. Years before my father's injury, my grandfather had quietly updated his will. Most of the family never paid attention because they assumed everything would eventually be divided equally. According to Jake, that wasn't exactly what happened. My grandfather believed different family members had different needs. Instead of dividing everything into identical portions, he wanted part of his estate used to help future generations pursue education, business opportunities, and personal development. The idea sounded reasonable. So why was it a secret? Jake leaned closer. Because your grandfather specifically mentioned you. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? He believed in you. The words hit harder than I expected. My grandfather died when I was still young. I remembered fishing trips, weekend visits, stories he told me in the garage. But I never knew he thought about my future that way. Jake continued. He used to tell people you were different. I looked down at the table. Different. That word had followed me my entire life. Most people used it as criticism. Apparently my grandfather hadn't. He thought you had vision. I remained silent. Jake's expression grew more serious. And some people didn't like hearing that. For the first time, pieces of the puzzle began moving into place. Not fitting together completely, but moving. What happened? Jake looked uncomfortable. The family argued. I frowned. Over what? Over whether your grandfather was right. The answer sounded ridiculous. Arguing over an opinion? But Jake quickly clarified. The problem wasn't what he believed. He paused. The problem was what he planned to do about it. My pulse quickened. According to Jake, my grandfather wanted a portion of the estate placed into a special fund. A fund designed to help future business ventures within the family. The first person he discussed using it for was me. At the time, I was only a teenager. Nobody thought much about it. Except Ryan. The moment Jake said his name, something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Just understanding. Slowly. Painfully. Understanding. Ryan had spent his entire life being the center of attention. The athlete. The achiever. The success story. Then our grandfather started praising someone else. Me. And apparently that bothered him more than anyone realized. Jake explained that several conversations became heated. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just repeated disagreements over the years. Small comments, subtle resentment, quiet frustrations, the kind that grow over time, the kind nobody notices until they're too large to ignore. I sat silently as everything started making sense. Not all at once, piece by piece. Like assembling a puzzle, scattered across decades. Ryan wasn't afraid of my failures. He was afraid of my potential. The realization made my stomach turn. Because potential is dangerous, not because of what it is, because of what it might become. As long as I struggled, everything stayed the same. Ryan remained the success story, the leader, the example, the family favorite. But if I succeeded, things changed. And some people don't handle change very well. Jake eventually reached into his jacket pocket. What is that? His expression grew serious. I wasn't sure if I should show you. A folded document appeared in his hand. Old, worn, yellow around the edges. My pulse quickened. What is it? He placed it carefully on the table. I immediately recognized the name at the top. My grandfather. The document contained notes related to his estate planning. Most of it involved routine financial details. Then I found a handwritten section near the bottom. The handwriting was unmistakably his. I read every word slowly, and as I did, emotion built inside my chest. The note wasn't about money. It wasn't about property. It wasn't about assets. It was about belief. My grandfather described me as the family member most willing to create something new. He wrote that entrepreneurs often look foolish before they become successful. He warned relatives not to confuse temporary struggles with permanent failure. Then came the sentence that stayed with me. The sentence I would never forget. One day, Ethan may surprise everyone. I stopped reading. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My grandfather wrote those words years before I started my business. Years before anyone knew what would happen. Years before I slept in my car. Years before my family abandoned me. And somehow, he saw something nobody else saw. The realization was both comforting and heartbreaking. Because he wasn't alive to witness any of it. Not the struggles, not the sacrifices, not the success, nothing. Jake remained quiet while I gathered my thoughts. Then he revealed one final detail. A detail that changed everything. After my grandfather died, discussions about the business fund quietly disappeared. The topic was rarely mentioned again. Nobody officially canceled it. Nobody formally approved it. It simply vanished. Like so many other opportunities in my life. But according to Jake, someone worked very hard to make sure it disappeared. And that person wasn't my mother. The name that came next sent a chill through my entire body. My Uncle David. I stared at Jake. What? He nodded. Your uncle fought harder than anyone. Nothing about that made sense. Uncle David had always been friendly, supportive, reasonable. At least that's what I thought. Jake shook his head slowly. There's a lot you don't know. My pulse accelerated. What don't I know? Jake hesitated. Then he delivered the sentence that would launch me into the biggest family secret of all. Your uncle wasn't protecting the family. The diner suddenly felt colder. He was protecting himself. I felt my stomach drop. Because according to Jake, Uncle David had been hiding something for years. Something connected to money. Something connected to my grandfather's estate. And something connected to why certain records mysteriously disappeared shortly after my grandfather died. The deeper I looked into my family's past, the darker the story became. And for the first time I realized my struggles might not have been caused by simple family dysfunction. They might have been connected to something much bigger. Something someone had spent years trying to keep buried. And if Jake was telling the truth, the evidence still existed. Somewhere. The drive home from the diner felt longer than usual. Jake's words kept replaying in my mind. Your uncle wasn't protecting the family. He was protecting himself. No matter how many times I thought about it, I couldn't make sense of it. Uncle David had always been one of the few relatives I genuinely liked. He attended family events. He told jokes. He offered advice. Compared to some of the others, he seemed reasonable. But over the previous few weeks, I had learned a painful lesson. People are not always who they appear to be. Sometimes the version you know is only part of the story. And sometimes the truth remains hidden until someone accidentally exposes it. That night, I barely slept. Every piece of information I had uncovered seemed connected somehow. The journal, the missing opportunities, the family fund, my grandfather's belief in me, Ryan's resentment. None of it felt random anymore. For years, I believed my life had simply unfolded through bad luck and poor decisions. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning I called Jake. I need proof. There was silence on the other end. Then he answered. I figured you'd say that. 2 days later, we met again. This time at his house. When I arrived, several boxes sat on the dining room table. Old boxes, storage boxes, the kind families forget about for years. Jake looked uncomfortable. These belonged to my father. I nodded. His father and my Uncle David had worked together on various family matters after my grandfather passed away. According to Jake, these boxes contained documents nobody had touched in nearly a decade. For hours we sorted through paperwork, tax records, insurance forms, receipts, letters. Most of it appeared completely ordinary. Then we found something interesting. A folder labeled estate planning. My pulse immediately quickened. Jake noticed too. Carefully we opened it. Inside were copies of several documents connected to my grandfather's estate. Most matched what we already knew. Then we found pages that appeared to be missing from official records. Pages nobody else seemed aware existed. The deeper we looked, the stranger things became. Certain signatures didn't match dates. Certain approvals appeared incomplete. Several handwritten notes referenced meetings that supposedly never happened. At first, I thought we might be misreading everything. Then Jake found a receipt. One simple receipt. A receipt connected to a private storage unit. The date immediately stood out. The storage unit had been rented less than a month after my grandfather died. The name on the contract belonged to Uncle David. I frowned. Why would he need a storage unit? Jake looked equally confused. No idea. But both of us knew the same thing. We needed answers. Over the next week, we continued investigating. The more information we uncovered, the more suspicious everything became. Eventually, we tracked down the facility. To our surprise, the storage contract still existed. The unit itself had been emptied years earlier. However, archived records remained. Most importantly, the facility kept copies of inventory declarations. When the employee handed us the paperwork, my heart nearly stopped. The listed contents included family financial records, estate documents, correspondence, property records, and several personal journals. I stared at the page. Why would Uncle David remove those documents from family records? The question bothered me constantly. Then another discovery made things even worse. One of the inventory descriptions referenced a notebook belonging to my grandfather, a notebook no one in the family had ever mentioned. A notebook that apparently contained personal observations and planning notes. The same grandfather who believed in me. The same grandfather who predicted I might one day surprise everyone. If that notebook still existed, it could answer countless questions. The problem was nobody knew where it went. According to the records, everything had been removed years ago. The trail appeared dead, at least until Jake received an unexpected phone call. The caller was an older woman named Linda, a retired legal assistant. Years earlier, she had worked with the attorney who handled my grandfather's estate. Most people would have ignored the call. Fortunately, Jake didn't. What she revealed changed everything. According to Linda, several family members attended private meetings after my grandfather's death. Nothing unusual there. Families often discuss estate matters. The unusual part involved one specific argument, a heated argument. An argument centered around documents. More specifically, documents certain people didn't want shared. I felt my stomach tighten. Who? Linda hesitated. Then she answered, "Your Uncle David." The room became completely silent. Linda explained that David repeatedly insisted certain papers were irrelevant. Old notes, personal observations, private correspondence. According to him, they served no purpose. Other people disagreed, especially my father. For the first time, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My father, the same man who defended me more than I ever realized, the same man whose letter revealed years of hidden conflict. Apparently he fought to preserve those records, and apparently he lost. The conversation with Linda lasted nearly an hour. By the time it ended, one thing became clear. Somebody had worked very hard to control what information remained available after my grandfather died. The question was why. That answer arrived sooner than expected. 3 days later, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I ignored unknown callers. This time I answered. The voice on the other end belonged to an elderly man. His name was Harold Bennett. At first, the name meant nothing to me. Then he explained who he was. For over 20 years, Harold had been one of my grandfather's closest friends. My pulse quickened immediately. Apparently Linda had contacted him after hearing about our search, and according to Harold, he possessed something very important. Something he believed belonged to me. What is it? There was a long pause. Then Harold answered quietly. I have your grandfather's notebook. For several seconds I couldn't speak. The notebook. The missing notebook. The one hidden from family records. The one nobody could locate. Somehow it had survived, and after all these years, someone still had it. But what Harold told me next was even more shocking. Because the notebook didn't just contain observations about family members. It contained names, dates, conversations, predictions. And according to Harold, one particular entry explained exactly why Uncle David spent years trying to keep it hidden. An entry so damaging that exposing it could permanently divide the family. An entry connected to a decision made decades earlier. A decision that influenced everything that happened afterward, including the years my family abandoned me. And according to Harold, once I read that entry, I would finally understand why certain relatives became terrified the moment I started becoming successful. I barely slept the night before meeting Harold Bennett. My mind wouldn't stop racing. For weeks, every answer had led to more questions. Every secret uncovered another layer of the story. Now, for the first time, it felt like I was finally approaching the center of it all. The next morning, I drove nearly 2 hours to a quiet town outside Cincinnati. Harold lived alone in a small house, surrounded by large oak trees. The property looked peaceful, ordinary. Nothing about it suggested it held answers that had remained hidden for years. When he opened the door, I immediately recognized him from old family photographs. He was older now, his hair completely gray, his shoulders slightly bent, but his eyes were sharp, the eyes of someone who remembered far more than he said. After a few minutes of conversation, Harold disappeared into another room. When he returned, he was carrying a worn leather notebook, my grandfather's notebook. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I simply stared at it. The notebook that had somehow survived years of family conflict. The notebook certain people worked hard to hide. The notebook that might finally explain everything. Harold carefully placed it on the table. Then he looked directly at me. Your grandfather wanted you to have this one day. The words hit me harder than expected. I slowly opened the cover. Immediately, I recognized my grandfather's handwriting. Page after page contained observations about family members, memories, advice, thoughts about life. Lessons he hoped future generations would learn. For nearly an hour, I read silently. Then I reached a section marked private. My pulse quickened. The entries became far more detailed, far more personal, and far more revealing. One entry described concerns about growing tensions within the family. Another mentioned disagreements involving money and expectations. Then I reached an entry written shortly before his death. The moment I started reading, everything changed. According to my grandfather, he had become increasingly concerned about Uncle David's behavior. Not criminal behavior, not anything dramatic. Something more subtle. Control, influence, manipulation. Over the years, David had gradually positioned himself at the center of important family decisions. At first, nobody noticed. Then it became impossible to ignore. My grandfather wrote that David often presented himself as the peacemaker. The reasonable voice. The person trying to keep everyone together. But behind closed doors, he frequently encouraged division. Quietly, strategically, always in ways that protected his own interests. I continued reading. The further I went, the more disturbing the entries became. My grandfather described multiple situations where David fueled disagreements between relatives while pretending to resolve them afterward. The pattern repeated again and again. Conflict, confusion, control. The realization made my stomach turn, because suddenly dozens of family memories looked different. Conversations, arguments, misunderstandings. Many of them involved David in one way or another. Then I reached the entry Harold specifically wanted me to read. The entry that explained everything. The date was nearly 15 years old, long before I started my business, long before I struggled financially, long before my family abandoned me. The entry described a private conversation between my grandfather and Uncle David, a conversation about the future, more specifically, about me. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Each sentence hit harder than the last. According to my grandfather, David believed I received too much attention whenever discussions about potential arose. He complained that family members often talked about my ideas, my creativity, my ambition, my possibilities. At first, I didn't understand why that mattered. Then I kept reading, and finally the truth emerged. David wasn't worried about me. He was worried about his own children, his own legacy, his own position inside the family. My grandfather wrote that David viewed success like a limited resource. If one person received recognition, someone else received less. If one person became important, someone else became less important. The mindset shocked me, but it also explained everything. People who think that way often see achievement as competition, even within families, especially within families. Then I found the sentence that changed everything. The sentence David never expected anyone to read. According to my grandfather's notes, David once said, "Ethan's dreams need to stay dreams." I stopped reading. The room felt completely silent. Harold watched me carefully. I looked back down at the page. The sentence remained there, unchanged, undeniable. Years before I launched a business, years before I became successful, years before anyone knew what my future held, David already wanted my ambitions contained, limited, controlled. The notebook explained why. He feared what might happen if I actually succeeded. Not because success would hurt me, because success would change family dynamics. The realization was almost unbelievable. For years, I thought my struggles were caused by bad luck. Then I thought they were caused by my mother's fear. Now I was seeing a much larger picture. Fear played a role, but so did influence. Years of influence. Years of conversations happening behind closed doors. Years of subtle pressure shaping decisions throughout the family. And David sat at the center of it all. Then I reached the final pages. The final pages contained something even more important than opinions. Evidence, specific examples, specific dates, specific conversations, names, details, documentation. Enough information to connect dozens of events across multiple years, including one event that immediately caught my attention, the year I lost my apartment. According to the notebook, David personally contacted several relatives after hearing about my financial situation. Not to organize help, not to check on me, to discourage involvement. The room spun. I could barely process what I was reading. My grandfather had documented concerns years before it happened, concerns that later became reality. The evidence wasn't proof of a crime, but it revealed a pattern, a disturbing pattern, one that suddenly explained why support vanished whenever I needed it most. I closed the notebook. For several minutes, neither Harold nor I spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "Now you know." I nodded slowly. But the truth was, I didn't know everything. Not yet. Because one question remained unanswered. A question bigger than all the others. Why was my family suddenly reaching out now? Why had the phone calls increased? Why were relatives who ignored me for years suddenly interested again? Harold seemed to anticipate the question. Because before I could ask it, he said something that made my blood run cold. "They know you're looking." I stared at him. "What?" He nodded. "They know you're uncovering the past." The room became silent once again. Then Harold revealed one final piece of information. Several family members had recently contacted him, asking questions, looking for the notebook, trying to find out what information remained, which meant one thing. The people involved were nervous, very nervous. And for the first time in my life, the balance of power inside the family was beginning to shift. Because the truth was no longer hidden. The truth was moving. And very soon, the entire family was going to be forced to confront it. For the next several days, I couldn't think about anything except the notebook. Every conversation, every discovery, every hidden truth, they all led to the same conclusion. The family I spent years trying to impress was never the family I thought it was. Some people acted out of fear. Some acted out of insecurity. Some simply remained silent when they should have spoken. And all those choices combined to shape the hardest years of my life. Yet despite everything I had learned, one question remained unanswered. What was I supposed to do now? I had evidence, I had answers. I had finally uncovered the truth. But exposing the truth and living with the consequences were two very different things. The answer arrived unexpectedly. 3 days later, my mother called. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something had changed. She sounded nervous. More nervous than I had ever heard her before. "Ethan." "Hi, Mom." There was a long pause. Then she asked a question that immediately caught my attention. "Have you been talking to Grandma?" I closed my eyes. The news was spreading. Slowly, quietly, but it was spreading. "Yes." Another silence followed. Then she asked the question she truly wanted answered. "What have you learned?" I looked out the window. For years I imagined confronting my family. For years I imagined angry arguments and dramatic accusations. Now that the moment had arrived, I felt strangely calm. "I've learned a lot." Her breathing became heavier. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally she whispered something I never expected. "I'm sorry." The words hit me harder than any confession. Because they sounded genuine, not defensive, not calculated, just tired, deeply tired. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. During that call, my mother admitted things she had never admitted before. She acknowledged blocking opportunities. She acknowledged discouraging relatives from helping. She acknowledged allowing fear to guide decisions that should have been guided by trust. Several times she cried. Several times I nearly did too. The most painful part wasn't hearing what she did, it was hearing why. For years she genuinely believed she was protecting me from disappointment. Only later did she realize she had become the source of it. By the end of the conversation, neither of us had all the answers. But something important happened. For the first time in many years, we spoke honestly. A week later, another call arrived. This one came from Ryan, my brother, the golden child, the person I once blamed for everything. He sounded uncomfortable from the moment he started talking. I guess you've been learning some things? I almost laughed. That was one way to describe it. Unlike my mother, Ryan didn't apologize immediately. Instead, he spent several minutes explaining himself, his career, his pressures, his responsibilities, the expectations he carried growing up. At first it sounded like excuses. Then he said something that completely surprised me. I was jealous of you. The words stunned me. Jealous? Of me? The brother sleeping in a car? The brother everyone mocked? The brother nobody believed in? Ryan laughed bitterly. You got something I never had. What? The freedom to chase what you wanted. For several seconds I didn't know how to respond. Then I realized something. While I spent years envying Ryan's success, he spent years envying my independence. Neither of us understood the other's burden. Neither of us understood the other's struggles. It didn't excuse his actions, but it helped explain them. The final conversation happened 2 weeks later, and it involved the person whose influence appeared throughout nearly every discovery, Uncle David. The family eventually organized a gathering at my grandmother's house. Not a celebration, not a holiday, a meeting. Everyone knew why they were there. The atmosphere felt tense from the moment people arrived. My mother sat quietly beside my father. Ryan avoided eye contact. Several relatives looked nervous. Others looked confused. Then David walked in. For years, he had controlled conversations, directed opinions, influenced decisions. This time felt different. For the first time, everyone already knew the story. And for the first time, nobody was interested in letting him control it. The discussion lasted hours. Questions were asked. Documents were reviewed. Old decisions were revisited. Some people became emotional. Others became defensive. Several arguments erupted. Yet through it all, one thing became impossible to deny. The family had spent years operating on assumptions. Assumptions about me. Assumptions about success. Assumptions about failure. And those assumptions damaged relationships that might never fully recover. David denied some accusations, admitted others, but by the end of the evening, his influence was gone. The power he once held over family conversations had disappeared. Not because someone took it from him, because people finally saw it clearly. And once people see the truth, it's difficult to pretend it doesn't exist. The strangest part of the entire experience came afterward. For years I dreamed about proving everyone wrong. I imagined becoming successful and watching people regret how they treated me. I imagined satisfaction, victory, closure. But when success finally arrived, none of those feelings lasted very long. What mattered wasn't the money. It wasn't the recognition, and it wasn't the business. What mattered was understanding. Understanding what happened. Understanding why it happened. And understanding that other people's limitations don't have to become your own. Over the following months, relationships slowly began changing. Some improved, some didn't. A few relatives disappeared again once they realized I wasn't interested in settling old scores. Others made genuine efforts to rebuild trust. My mother and I started speaking regularly. My father and I became closer than we had ever been. Even Ryan and I found a way forward. Not because the past disappeared, because we finally stopped pretending it never happened. As for me, I continued building my business, continued growing, continued moving forward. But I carried something more valuable than success: perspective. The perspective that comes from surviving rejection. The perspective that comes from discovering uncomfortable truths. And the perspective that comes from realizing your worth was never determined by the opinions of people who couldn't see your potential. Today, when people ask how I became successful, they usually expect business advice, marketing strategies, investment tips, growth techniques. What they don't expect is the real answer. The real answer is that success started the moment I stopped waiting for permission. The moment I stopped measuring my value through other people's expectations. The moment I accepted that some people would never believe in me and chose to keep going anyway. Because the truth is, the people who abandoned you don't get to decide how your story ends. You do. And sometimes the greatest success isn't proving them wrong. It's finally proving to yourself that they were never right in the first place. Thank you for listening to my story. And if this story touched you in any way, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss any of our upcoming stories.